once, it seems like at this point, maybe the biggest news is the fallout from Kamala's interview with Brett Baer. And I think the fact alone that she decided that her campaign elected to do an interview on Fox News when they'd refused the debate before is very telling in terms of kind of the level of desperation that was reached. But it's the fallout from that interview that is really just so important right now. And we're witnessing a whole scale change. But there's also another element. I think we want to talk about that, but there's another element we want to talk about as well. And that's the aspect that this was really the first real interview she faced. And it ended up ending her, seems like, ended her campaign. And all this could have happened at the very beginning if we only had an honest media. And I think that's really the subplot to this. So with that, why don't you kick us off?
I would slightly change that. I'd say it was the end of her or would have been the end of her campaign had the media been honest, or if the media was honest. So there is still like some ember there. And the media keeps it burning. And you're absolutely right. The interview was extremely revealing because for the first time, probably ever, and certainly in the past 5 years or so, she was asked actual questions, factual questions about policies and about things like that. And she had absolutely no answers. That at one point she said, "You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about." Brett Baer said, "Well, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about." And frankly, I had no idea what she was talking about. I don't think anyone objective and honest had any idea what she was talking about. It was just a sort of a thing she threw out just to pass time, to filibuster. You know what I'm talking about? Well, no, we actually don't. But she's not used to that. She's not used to someone saying, "Well, I don't. Please explain." Then, of course, the other thing was any question about substance was immediately countered with Donald Trump. That was always the answer. It was absolutely ridiculous. So the scary part, in a way, apart from the media keeping kind of the embers kind of just burning there slightly, is how different the perception was. But I don't think I think too much is made of it in terms of, half of America saw it this way, half of America saw it that way. I think any honest, objective, rational person, in fact, just any person with a functioning brain who watched that would have seen it exactly the way that we just saw it. And this is not partisan, this is not political or whatever. There's a guy asking questions about substance and policy, and there's a candidate who just simply doesn't answer anything, just throws out these lines, as we just said. That's the objective view of it, irrespective of what your politics is. And it happens sometimes the other way around as well. So again, this is not partisan, this is not political, this is just objective. So anyone with a functioning brain would have seen it that way. And yet we end up with a situation quite, crazily in a way. It's just really something that I've been thinking about ever since the interview took place, is we end up in a situation where half the country thinks she did fantastic and half the country thinks she's a laughingstock. And, I'm still trying to really get to the core of that, to really put my finger on that. Like, how do we get to the point? Is it really that half the country doesn't have a functioning brain? No. But what is that? There is something there, and I haven't quite been able to put my finger on it.
It may be Trump hatred. I think that's one thing that has been kind of altering the politics that we've been witnessing is instead of being for a candidate, these people are against Trump. And I think most of, it's how Biden got elected. I mean, Biden's was a turnip. Kamala flushed out in the first, 5 minutes of the 2020 election. So I think that probably plays a role. I also think it's probably not half and half. I think it's probably, we get a biased view from spending a lot of time on X, and X isn't real world. I think there's the hardcore that's always going to support Kamala, and that's not going to change. And I mean, I think the betting markets are already reflecting that. Obviously, and what I mean by that is I know it's 60-40 split. What I mean is that sudden change in the betting markets is capturing that middle part of America that's not, what we see daily. But I thought there was two things that really surprised me about her interview, and you kind of touched on one of them. And that was the first one, how was she so unprepared? The fact that she had no answers. You had to have an idea of what types of questions were coming at you. And the second element is that it wasn't that Bear was a big, bad, mean guy who just kneecapped her at every point. He asked the sort of questions that in a rational world, everybody would be expected to be answered. You know, your administration established a policy of open borders. We saw a landslide of illegal immigrants come in. What's changed? You know, what just address that issue. Fundamental. Economics, address that issue. These are all of the questions that he asked were the kind of questions that a rational person just calmly, coolly would want to ask a candidate. And I don't know if that reflects her mentality that she's so used to being coddled by the press. But I can't fathom that her campaign didn't anticipate that they would get some of those questions. And as you said, wholly unprepared to address them. It was astonishing. And I think the penultimate moment was when she, was blaming Trump again, and Brett said, "But you've been the administration for the last 4 years." That was devastating because there's no answer to that.
There isn't, and the unpreparedness. I mean, there was that one question, for instance, about how many illegals have been let in the past 4 years. I mean, it's an entirely reasonable, but also entirely objective question. There is an actual answer to that question, a real world answer. We don't know the exact answer, but since she was the border czar and since she was in charge for the past 4 years, it's more than legitimate to ask her that question. And of course, immediately she was like, "Yes, immigration is important and Donald Trump." So it was that same pattern over and over. Now, they say, I don't know this because I've obviously never met her, never spoken to her or anything like that. But they say she's just fundamentally lazy. Which does kind of sound about right, given her path to the top, where she's never really had to work for anything. Everything was always kind of presented to her. And she's just been this vessel in many ways, just like Joe Biden. There's an interesting parallel there. She's been this vessel for bigger forces to carry certain messages and to carry certain policies into the political arena. So she's that puppet. And you go back to her early days in California. There's always been that apparently she started off as a prosecutor, even though it's been very difficult to find any cases that she actually prosecuted. Right. I mean, there's a difference between being a prosecutor sitting in an office or being in a courtroom kind of doing the work, and that second part has been kind of totally, no one's found any evidence for that, which is important because that's when you have to show that you actually are able to think on your feet and do these things, which
she couldn't show she worked at McDonald's. Well,
and then she didn't. So she worked her way up the ladder. We don't have to get into the details of that, but it's just certainly I have not seen any hard work, effort, skill, anything like that attached to her rise. In fact, we just now have the scandal of her book, which was plagiarized. Again, that's kind of very fitting, isn't it? You might say, well, she did write a book once. Well, she actually didn't, because first of all, there was a ghostwriter. Second of all, huge chunks of the book were plagiarized. So that brings us back to the laziness. So she just rose because she was that vessel. And by the way, when I said Joe Biden was that vessel too, when he entered the Senate in 1972, a very young man, he was kind of co-opted by the elder statesmen in the Senate who used him as their vessel throughout these years. And that's how and he was in Delaware, he had a safe seat and so on and so forth. Again, another person who hasn't really achieved much in terms of actual hard work, original ideas, intelligence, anything like that. So they're very similar in that way. So I would say laziness is a big part of it. But what struck me, and I was going to get to this point because we haven't talked about this yet, is there's a lot of lazy politicians out there. There's a lot of not very clever politicians out there. And she's certainly one of them. She's probably the least intelligent person ever to run for president. But there are others who are kind of on that same IQ level, and they manage somehow to perform better. And that's what struck me the most out of this interview. Cut away the content, cut away all the filibustering, all that kind of stuff. She doesn't have that second layer of skills to make up for the lack of content. And that's something Obama was so good at. The charm, the vivaciousness, the sort of disarming the reporter, saying things to please the crowd, all that kind of stuff. Just that natural ability. She doesn't have any of that. It just is zero. She doesn't have any of those skill sets, which is a very terrible combination, isn't it? No content and no kind of interpersonal skills.
Well, that touches on another surprising element. I guess something that's always sort of been in the back of my mind, nagging at me. And that is the fact that we have two candidates in a row that are absolutely terrible. From Biden, who is just, he really hasn't been a president, right? He's not really even a president. And then Kamala comes into the picture. How do the Democrats field, such terrible candidates coming off of the Obama era? And as much as I utterly despise Obama, he was fantastic at what he did. And out of the entire field, I find it very implausible. I kind of get why Biden stumbled into the position. And yes, the establishment likes having somebody who's malleable and they can kind of, Obama can work behind the scenes and implement the policies they want. But I think, they probably felt like their hand ended up getting forced by Kamala. I'm guessing when we get sort of a dissection of this, we're going to find that she jumped into the ring sort of preemptively right at the time that Biden was being leg swept. And there was probably a lot of behind the scenes negotiations and teeth gnashing because I don't think they wanted Kamala. But nevertheless, how does the DNC put forth two such terrible candidates? I kind of shudder to think what might have happened if Michelle Obama, for example, had elected to throw her hat into the ring. I don't think she ever intended to, but just as an example, what might actually have transpired instead of where we find ourselves now.
Well, I think that was sort of that was baked in 2020 when Biden or Biden's handlers picked Kamala, because at that we talked about this a few months ago before the whole Biden coup happened, before Biden was deposed. Remember, we talked about it on this show, and we said that as much as they would like to have someone else, it's going to be extremely difficult to do that because they're the ones who anointed her as the vice president. And they're the ones who anointed her on these DEI criteria. So then to kind of throw her out is a very, very bad idea in the sense that they'll just be made to look very bad.
But the issue I have there, Hans, is the fact that I agree with you that that's why she was originally selected, right? But there was a period in this first, year or so that they were attempting to kind of train Kamala and prepare her. And I think the idea was, frankly, that Biden was going to step down at some point, and Kamala might have actually assumed the presidency in the, initial 4-year period. And she proved to be so utterly incompetent and untrainable that they basically shifted their strategy entirely to trying to hide Kamala for the remaining 3 years. So I guess that's kind of my backdrop, is that yes, they did that, but they also found out that she was completely incompetent, untrainable, a total failure, no charisma, just a problem child all around. They hid her. What were they doing in those 3 years to prepare for whoever? I have trouble believing that they didn't at least give some serious thought to somebody else. And I guess it surprises me that they weren't more prepared than that.
No, I do agree with that. I think what was the plan was to try and soldier on somehow, muddle through.
Maybe, yeah.
Get to November, have all these lawfare cases against Trump, and Trump is Hitler and whatever. Somehow get Biden over the line, similar to what happened in 2020. Have a late night ballot found in suitcases under tables and things like that, and somehow you muddle through, somehow you get him over the finish line, and then you replace him in short order with her. At that point, it doesn't matter that she has no charisma and that she's completely hopeless, because, well, she's the president and you control the puppet. But unfortunately for Biden, or for them, and that's why I don't think it was planned. I don't think the meltdown, when was it, June 27th, when a debate happened with Trump, I don't think that was planned, precisely for the reason that we've just discussed here. And And when that happened, they knew, okay, we're not going to be able to drag this guy over the finish line, so we're going to have to do something else. And that's when they were stuck with her without a plan B. So no, I completely agree with you. But the question still is to me, why did they appoint her in the first place? Why was she chosen in the first place? Because, come on, anyone who was paying attention in 2018, 19, and so on knew she was an airhead, knew she was useless. What made them think that she was trainable?
Well, certainly it seemed like she was the favorite, the one that was back in 2020 at the very beginning, that she was maybe the establishment's candidate over Biden. And then we went through a shift. Remember, Tulsi absolutely destroyed her,
Right.
pretty much just ended her in that 2019 debate. I think up until that point, that I think if you were behind the scenes, just my opinion, that they actually wanted Kamala, and maybe that's why Kamala continued. Now, that still leaves the question of why did they want Kamala in the first place, and I have no answer for that whatsoever. One thing that occurred to me is there's got to be a lot of second guessing. Could you imagine if I understand they had their conference, and they had kind of had to get her in at that point in time. If they were going to swap out Biden, they were up against it. But remember the euphoria surrounding Kamala. It was so strong. I mean, I think people really, certainly on the left, were utterly convinced she was going to win. It was just this wave of relief. Imagine if that started now. It would be something entirely different. But they put her in long enough because she's so bad that she basically couldn't handle being in front of cameras or being in front of interviewers for just 4 months. It just
Yep.
too early.
Yeah, no, she couldn't get it over the finish line precisely because 4 months is too long, and eventually people will find out the truth. You're absolutely right. And I predicted this back in, I think, June or so, when I said when they put this guy Biden out to pasture, that's when the media will tell us that Kamala is the new Obama, and she will become wildly popular very quickly, and it will actually work. And that is exactly what happened for about a month and a half or so. If you look at her negative favorability ratings, suddenly they just shot up. I mean, she went up 10, 20%, some crazy number in that first month or so. And you're absolutely right. It's been going downhill ever since because, well, when did it actually start going downhill? I mean, we can pinpoint when it started going downhill. It started going downhill when she started doing interviews. There was that first interview together with her waltz, where she needed her helper there. Not that he's much of a help, but anyway. And the more interviews she's done, the more downhill it's gone.
The pressure just mounted on her, didn't it? In terms of, she was shying away from any interview whatsoever. And frankly, it was proving successful. And she caved to the pressure. And you're right, when she went out and did that interview with her, comfort buddy and had her little security blanket next to her, and it was terrible right from there. And it's only gotten worse. And obviously, this recent media blitz is reflective of what had to be just awful internal pollings. And I remember back kind of in the first half of this year, you and I were having this kind of friendly go back and forth on the whole scenario. And I was saying, no, they can't be putting in Kamala. She's so terrible. There's no way they want to go with her. And you were saying they would. And they did, shockingly, from my opinion, because it's just the outcome is ultimately predictive. And now here we are.
In in politics, you either need to have good policies and good results, or you need to be able to make people feel good, about themselves, feel good about stuff. Just that sort of that empathy, that charisma, all these kinds of things. Bill Clinton we talked about Obama. Bill Clinton was also very, very good at this.
Oh, yeah.
She is neither. I keep coming back to this point, but it's so important. She is, you watch these interviews, there's nothing about making people feel good. It just doesn't exist.
Hillary had the benefit of, she was kind of a policy wonk, if you want to say. In other words, as much as I despise Hillary, I don't think she's dumb. And I disagree with everything she did, but I think she knew what she was doing. And I think she did it for nefarious purposes. But aside, I don't think that she's incompetent. But for her, she was so dislikable that it overwhelmed the incompetence. Now you bring in Kamala, and she's both incompetent and intensely dislikable.
I think if Hillary had gotten in 2016, she'd have been a much, much better president than Biden has been,
Yeah.
because there is some residual competence there. But it is more important, obviously, especially for a Democrat candidate, where leftists in general tend to kind of judge things more by, feelings. Not all of them, but that generally speaking, that
Generally speaking, yeah.
happens more on that side than on the conservative side. So it's very important for Democrats to have candidates that make people feel good. Obama was an absolute master at it. You go back, Kerry, 2004, lost close election. He was not so good at it. You go back, Clinton is absolute master at it. Gore lost very close election. Again, not very good at it. So that seems to be sort of the magic potion that is needed here, the magic ingredient, the fact that they make people feel good. And Hillary, again, she had the competence, or again, we will disagree with policy and so on, but at least she knew what she was doing, and the brain works fine. But now they've had these candidates who are not capable of doing that. I guess Biden in 2020 maybe a bit more than otherwise would have been the case because of COVID. Like, oh, he's that old grandfather who will take care of things. He's been around for a long time. He's that steady hand, that sort of message that was pushed. So they gave him a bit of that feel good stuff. And of course, Trump being, the pariah and all that. But Kamala just doesn't have that. I know this is like the second or third time I'm saying it, but I'm so fascinated by the fact that they fielded someone who is completely incompetent, but also doesn't have any of the usual skills of a politician. It's just mind-boggling, isn't it?
It really is, start to finish. The other element of this, too, that we started off with, but probably is worth touching on, is just the idea of what this exposes about the media if people are being honest. Because again, the questions that were asked of her were straightforward. They're questions that anybody could have anticipated. And instead, the media's entire purpose was to keep those questions, the most basic of questions, from being asked. And, we keep saying the mask is off the media, but the media, it's foolish if we just pretend that the media doesn't have any power, because they absolutely do. It's how Kamala got this far. It's how Biden survived 4 years. The media hid Biden and just pretended and ignored, as we pointed out, Biden's increasing decrepitancy. They kept telling us everything's fine, and their side believed it. And I think there was a large element of their population that was distinctly shocked at that last debate with Trump, where we saw Biden for what he really was when he didn't have the proper meds and it was the wrong time of day and everything else. And we were all like, we've been telling you, this is who the guy is. None of us were surprised, but most everybody on the left was just, aside from the people propagating the narrative, I think the general populace was just deeply shocked at what they saw. And so it's, we don't want to be dismissive of the fact that the media still has the power to create these narratives and carry people. And if we'd have, I guess for me, it just continues to highlight how utterly deceptive the media is. Just a couple honest questions, and we would have ended up in a very different spot, and Kamala would have been in trouble right out of the gate. And instead, they did exactly as you said, everything under their power to build her up and create this fictitious hollow shell of a candidate who was never a real person.
Well, of course, but that would have had to have happened before the Biden coup, because then, so she'd been exposed as the total airhead that she is. Then Democrats would have had an opportunity to replace Biden with someone else, and then the whole thing would have taken a different turn. But we're really talking about the media not only lying in the past few months, but throughout the whole kind of term, especially the primary season. That was the opportunity for Democrats to make the switch, to have an actual primary. And of course, then the first thing that would have been exposed if that had happened is that Biden is no longer with it. And then they would have started to think about, well, what do we do then? Oh, we got Kamala. Well, is she able to garner any votes, just even as part of the primary? And she would have struggled. And, the whole thing would have taken a very different course. And of course, this brings us back to something we've already discussed, which is Robert Hur, the special counsel. I still think he was giving them a heads up. So back at the beginning of this year, Robert Hur came out with his report on the fact that Biden had kept all these classified documents in his basement and his garage and so on, far, far worse than whatever was Trump was keeping. And Robert Hur said, and the language, I remember when that report came out, and before I downloaded the report, I saw someone tweet like a couple of sentences from the report. And I could have sworn, I would have bet money had you asked me back then, is this real? I could have sworn, no, this guy has just invented something. I mean, it was pretty extreme language. And that language was, of course, entirely true and accurate, which was that Robert Hur said that Joe Biden is too senile to stand trial. Therefore, we will not bring charges. Now, again, this is 8, 9, 10 months ago, whatever. It might sound exaggerated. No, this is exactly what he said. And so the media immediately circled the wagons for Biden, like, oh my goodness, how can this Robert Hur say that, and so on. And they all got it wrong. What Robert Hur was doing is, it was still early enough. They still had this was 7 months before Biden was deposed. That's a long time. He was giving them a heads up. Hey guys, this guy is not going to carry through till November, and certainly not through till 2028. It's not going to happen. And instead they just reflexively went into the opposite direction. No, Hur is lying.
And that's a great point because, if anybody has any doubts, it's not like Robert Hur is a good guy. He ran cover for Biden. Trump was treated entirely differently from, much lesser transgressions. So everything that Hur did in his report, he exposed a few things, but, you and I both delved into that pretty deeply. And Hur didn't go into any of the major issues, treated him with kid gloves, but then he decided to insert that language. And there is no way that would happen under Biden's DOJ without DOJ blessing. So you are absolutely right that Hur was sending out warning signals. Hey, look, he's not in any trouble, but you guys got to do something. This is a major problem. And I guarantee you that decision was not made by Robert Hur. He didn't unilaterally go and decide to insert that language. He may have raised the issue, but there had to be higher up blessings. And as you said, it was ignored. So they did have their opportunity.
It was Merrick Garland, who had to not only release the report. I mean, that's the first part of it.
That's the first right there, right?
He could have held back. He could have said, no, this is confidential. This has to be redacted, blah, 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 blah.
Could have redacted. Could have even released and redacted the salient parts, whatever.
Could have issued a summary, which is what Barr did back in 2019. Now, Barr was actually trying to help Mueller. That whole situation was totally, misrepresented by the media. But it still turned out to be a terrible decision on Barr's part, because then the media turned it all around and said, oh my goodness, Barr's covering for Trump, when he was doing the opposite. But okay, that we can talk about that some other time. So in this case, it was Garland's choice to release. And the other thing, didn't it strike you as just incredible how fast, like the report was written, and like it was a day or two after, it was like a very, very quick turnover. Boom, the report was out. And, as you say, that was not Hur's decision. That was Garland's decision. And the second thing I would add is they call them a special counsel, but under the law, ever since the independent counsel statute lapsed or expired, this is like 25 years ago. So these people are no longer independent. Hence, they're not called independent counsel. They're called special counsel. They are Department of Justice employees. The guy works under Garland. The guy answers to Garland. The guy has to talk to Garland about what he does. The guy has to get his budget from Garland. This is one of the problems that John Durham ran into. But I think once people understand that part, the sort of the closeness of Garland and whatever goes on with these special counsel, a lot of things fall into place. Yep.
All of which leaves us with kind of back to some of our original questions: is how did the DNC let this happen? It's really something to behold. And now we're watching, we're basically watching Kamala in freefall.